Good morning, everyone. So if you haven't met me yet, I am Pastor Kevin. I have been pastor over at the Sanctuary campus for the last couple of years. And I grew up in church. I'm going to scoot this away because that's going to drive me nuts. I grew up in church, the kid in the pew who always wanted to get up and talk as much as possible. And out of that enthusiasm, I grew up to become a pastor and preacher who talks too much. All the Sanctuary folks are laughing loudest. But I promise I'm going to do my best this morning. So here we go. Would you please pray with me before we continue on? God, thank you so much for this day and for this time that we get to be together. I pray that your Spirit has been with all of us this week, all of us preparing for us to hear your word this morning with me as I prepared something good to share. May your Spirit continue to do that work and to open our hearts and our minds to hear you speak to us today. Amen. When you were a kid, it seems like everyone has at least one story like this. When you were a kid, what was the thing that you saw in a movie or on television that halfway through you realized that you were way too young to be watching whatever it was? Maybe it was something that you realized was way too violent or scary or adult. Maybe you didn't even realize it at the time, but when you're older, you're like, I can't believe my parents let me watch that. I grew up in the 80s, and oh man, the 80s were a wild time. My parents, though, were pretty guarded about a lot of what me and my brother and my sister saw, but Chris's parents weren't. Chris was the kid who lived down the street. He was an only child, so he had everything first, so we loved to go over and play at his house. And his parents had a pretty ample VHS collection, and they didn't really care what Chris spent his free time watching. So I would go over to Chris's house with my brother, and we would watch all kinds of things. I remember being 6 or 7 years old and getting to watch Die Hard for the first time, unaccompanied by a parent. Or even a movie that might seem tamer, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, but it means that I got to watch one man rip the beating heart out of another man's chest over and over and over every time we watched the movie. The 80s were a wild time when this unique phenomenon went on where adult movies were actually actively marketed to children. If you remember those times, there is a YouTube channel that my son and I like to watch. It's called Toy Galaxy. It's a lot of fun because what they do is they review like old toys from yesteryear, and if there was a TV show or a movie, they'll often kind of go through the development of how that cartoon led to this toy and stuff like that. And so I never grew up, and my son is 11, so we like to watch it together and look at all the toys. And it's funny because since this channel has been around for like 4 or 5 years now, they've done all the big hits. And so now they're kind of like, you can feel them kind of scraping the bottom of the barrel of stuff to do episodes about. And recently there was an episode about the RoboCop children's cartoon that came out in the late 80s, early 90s. It was very short-lived, probably for good reason. But along with the RoboCop children's cartoon, which was an extremely R-rated movie, if you chuckled a little bit when you heard me say that, it's because that movie is extremely graphically violent. It's the furthest thing you could think of as being a children's movie. But sure enough, some executive was like, you know who would love to see a cartoon of this? Children. And we can make action figures and sell them and stuff like that. It was a really weird time. And the whole time, the host is talking about the development from the movie to the cartoon to the toy line. He kept just kind of asking the question, like, what were these people thinking giving this to children? And so, of course, as we were watching, my son was like, oh, have you seen the movie they're talking about, Dad? And I was like, yeah, And he was like, can we watch it? And I was like, no. Because we try to be better now than maybe some of our parents were back in the day. Because we've learned so much about psychology and the way that kids' brains really are not ready to handle violence and death and dark subject matter while their brain is still literally being formed. We don't want to traumatize them when they're younger so that way they won't be able to approach real life when they're older. And that can be easy to do when it comes to movies and TV shows. We can kind of, control what our kids see pretty well. But then we go to church. And it's tricky when the Bible story is rather R-rated, right? Have you ever been halfway through reading some children a Bible story at VBS or at home, and then you realized halfway through, oh no, I've made a terrible mistake? Have you ever actually, for instance, tried to read children the real Noah story, like from a real Bible? And halfway through you realize, oh no, the children's Bible is there for a reason because it pretties up the story and sands off all of its rough edges and stuff like that. You're going to get a lot of interesting questions from your children as you tell the story from a real Bible. When I was a kid in my little Methodist church in Northern California, we had this magical tool in every Sunday school classroom, the flannel graph. Does anyone remember the flannel graph? Okay, for those of you guys who don't, flannel graph in a pre-VeggieTales era of children's ministry, flannel graph was just a big board that had a big piece of flannel over it. It's a very clever name. And then with the board, when you bought it from the children's publishing company, it came with this big kit that had all kinds of paper cutouts that also had flannel on the back because it was like a soft Velcro you could stick onto the board and you can move the characters around. So, oh, here's Jesus and here's the loaves and fishes, and they break into, look, he's feeding the crowd, you know what I mean, and stuff like that. It was a pre-PowerPoint era of children's ministry. And I remember sitting there and hearing the flannel graph version of the Noah story. Oh, God wanted Noah to build a boat, and here's the water, and then here's the boat, and and there's a little flannel Noah and a flannel Noah's family, and then there was one big flannel piece that had like 2 elephants, 2 lions, and 2 giraffes, so it was like all the animals all together. And we heard the story about how God saved Noah and all the animals and stuff like that, and it wasn't until I was older and I read the story for myself where I was like, oh, there's a couple pieces missing from the flannel graph kit. And I bet it's because the flannel graph company and certainly the Sunday school teachers who just volunteered to be helpful and didn't want to end up in this predicament didn't want to have to tell the full story and have to field questions from kids. Well, who are those people and why are they floating? And yet we leave those characters out of the story when we tell it to kids. Every church I've ever worked at somewhere has a Noah's Ark mural in the children's classroom, and yet those characters aren't in the mural, right? It's all sunshine and rainbows and giraffes. So many of the Bible stories are weird and rough, and they might not even be good for children. And so therefore, even those of us who are adults then have a hard time figuring out what to do with those stories. And it's my own fault. Me and Lynn set the stories in the scriptures for this series, but I kind of got the lucky preaching straw of getting to tell the Abraham wants to kill Isaac story. And if you're like me, you maybe, if you grew up going to church, you maybe heard this story being told to you as a child, as this heroic story. And it wasn't until I was older that I realized there's a deep problem, not with the story, but with the way that we often tell it and the way preachers like me preach it. Because the way that I heard it was like this. It might sound familiar. Once upon a time, God wanted to test Abraham's faith. So he went to Abraham and said, hey, Abraham, I want you to go kill your son. And those of us who have heard the story before are like, what a hilarious prank on Abraham. Oh, will his face be red, right? Because we know how it ends, but it doesn't seem so cute for Abraham or Isaac or Sarah. We don't even get to hear her point of view in the story. And then but sure enough, Abraham decides, yes, I'm going to do this. So he takes his son up the mountain and then he ties him up. And then as he's grabbing the knife, then the angel swoops down to stop him at the last second. And, the angel stops him and has a good message for Abraham. This is the way it was told to me when I was a kid. Because you are willing to kill your son, you get rewarded, Abraham. Gold stars, great job, you're the hero. It was as if the Spirit of God had people write this story as if to communicate the message. Hey, readers, and hey, church people now, thousands of years later, why can't you be more like Abraham, trusting me fully? It's time to prove your faith. Get your kids and climb that mountain. If that's the moral of the story, it's a bad story. Doesn't it feel in your heart that that goes really far against the Spirit of Christ? So what do we do? If the moral of the story is be like Abraham, God might ask you to sacrifice your children, and having faith and being a good person means saying yes. It just can't be, right? So what do we do with this story then? If we look closer, the story itself is going to give us our first clue about what to do with this story. At the very end, the angel goes in and stops Abraham and says, don't kill your son. And then it follows with this. And Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called this place, the Lord will provide. And it's said to this day, so for hundreds of years later, this is what people take away with the story. On the mount of the Lord, it shall be provided by God. At the end of the story, Abraham throws a worship service for God not having him sacrifice Isaac. And then he names the place after God, the Lord will provide. And then people tell the story about how God provided in that place. They knew the clue to the story, but so often we skip over it. Because at the end, who gets praised? At the end, who's being given the gold stars? It's not Abraham, it's God. And so that maybe then the story isn't really supposed to be about Abraham at all. If there's a hero to the story, if there's someone that we should want to be like, it's not Abraham, it's God. So then just what on earth is this weird story trying to show us about God? Because that doesn't even solve all the tension, right? Because at first glance, this story doesn't put to God in too good of a light. Like he's just tricking Abraham and leading him on, and it seems kind of cruel. But maybe God is up to something else in the story. Two things are going to help us out. Two little bits of history. And Sanctuary folks, I promise this will be quick. The writers of these stories didn't live in the world that we live in. They lived in a much different world. They lived in a polytheistic society. They were surrounded by people from other tribes, other nations, even other empires, who all had their own stories about their own gods. And so when you met these folks, you would share the stories of your gods, and all the stories kind of lived together. It was a polytheistic culture and world. So when you were being the storyteller, and you were telling a story about your God, you weren't trying to prove that God exists the way that we often try to tell stories about God. Because they'd be like, well, of course, but there's many gods, so what's special about your God? So if you told your creation story, you weren't trying to prove the point, well, God created the world, so we can all go home, and that's the lesson we learn. It was every people has a story about their God creating the world. What's special about the God that I believe in? What's different about the God that I believe in? The primary question for the storytellers then is, what kind of God is my God? And so what am I trying to tell you what God is like? And so also, second point from history that's helpful for us in understanding what's going on in the story, we know from historical records that in the ancient world, there were some people and some places, some religious systems where child sacrifice was actually practiced. And so to the people of the ancient world, it was just assumed that sometimes, depending on who your God is, that God is going to knock on your door one day and say, it's time to give me your kids. It's what I demand. If you want to keep me happy, pay up. I'm here to take what you have. Have you ever noticed at the beginning of even the story as we read it in our Bible, Abraham hears God say, go sacrifice Isaac, and he just gets up to go do it. It's not a twist in the story for him. Because in his worldview, in the world that he lives in, sometimes that's what gods do. Other stories, he's going to bargain for people's life. He doesn't do it with Isaac, because that's sometimes what gods do. So then if that's similar to the other gods in the story, from other stories, what's different about this God in this story? We have to follow along with the rest of it, and we see that God intervenes when Abraham is ready to strike the blow to Isaac. Other gods in the world might ask for the life of this boy, but this God says, no, you do not give me the lives of others. That's not the kind of God that I am. So what is the story trying to teach us? What kind of God is Abraham's God? It's that this God is a God who doesn't take life, but gives. He's the Lord who provides. And he gave the life of Isaac in the first place. That's the kind of God that the story is telling us this God is. Abraham's God is the Lord who provides. This is the kind of God who created the world and gave all things life, and has yet refused to let it die when things go wrong in the story so far. This is the kind of God who then provides a plan for saving all things, and he calls Abram to be part of it to bless all the families of the earth, not just his favorites. This is the kind of God who then provides Abraham with a son, bringing joy to him and Sarah in their old age, and is not going to turn around and take that boy back. Because the God of Abraham is not the kind of God who is cruel or angry or tricky. Abraham's God gives and loves to give more. It's the same God that James finds later. And in James' passage, he describes God as the giver of every good and perfect gift, right? It's the same God that we find in the story of Jesus. Jesus, God walking, who decides when faced with a crowd of people that are loving and adoring him, he's not there to take from them. He sees they're hungry, and he's going to give and give and give and give until all are fed and have life. It's even a story following the story of Jesus, who chooses not to take life, but lets the creation take his. It's a kind of God who would rather give his own life than take from the people. It's a kind of God who gives his life freely so that all might have life through him. The God of Abraham is the kind of God who does not withhold anything but gives all that he has. So what is then the lesson for us? If we're to emulate God, the story is beckoning us, challenging us to be providers and givers like God is. We will be blessed then to be a blessing. So here we are, St. Mark's, UMC. We used to be two churches, but we've been united together. We're in this weird big moment of our own lives. And we are together for one reason, because we believe that we heard the voice of God, that we will fulfill the mission that God has given us better together than apart. We didn't come together just for fun. Trust me, the merger process has not been fun. There's been fun along the way, but it takes a lot of work, right, for those of you involved. And it will be fun as we go, but it takes work to keep it going. We didn't even do this for our survival, right? We just did this because it was the right thing to do. It was what God was calling us to. Because we believe in the same mission of Abraham, or as the United Methodist Church itself puts it, our mission is to make disciples of Christ who transform the world. It's an exciting mission to be a part of. But to fulfill this mission, we will have to step out to our community and introduce other people to God, possibly for the first time, and tell them stories to tell them what kind of God that we believe in. We might even have to correct the way that they've been told the story wrong in the past. When we meet those people outside of our community, what kind of God will they find among us? Will they find God who is taking life from the world, or more interested in giving life to it? Among us and hanging out with us through our words and actions, will they see that God and that we then have become a people who give and provide for others? Or are we the kind of folks who just mainly look out for ourselves? Would we even dare, like God, to give sacrificially? Or will people find that we are just simply obsessed with our own survival? These are tough questions, but this is a tough story for tough times. This story challenges us to become the kind of people who give like God does. And so this merger, my friends, will only work if we all learn to give like God does. To seek not to serve ourselves, but to love and serve each other. To not be divided by things like sites or names or buildings or preferred worship styles, but instead to seek first the ways that we can give life to each other. So this week, may we, like Abraham, stop and name the ways that God has provided for us, the ways that God's care through Christ has changed us. I like your mission statement. It works. And may these memories of God's love, using the words of Sanctuary's mission statement, inspire us to serve one another as we journey together and offer our community a way to connect with our God, a good God, a loving God, a giving God who is dying and longing to give everyone, all families, all houses, all people around us, new life and not to take from them. Amen. Would you please pray with me? God, I thank you so much for this challenging story. It's weird and it's tough, and there's a lot of stories like it. But God, thanks for showing us something new in the story. Maybe we've heard the story taught well before, but maybe this is the first time that we've heard it ever, or maybe this is the first time that we're hearing it in a way that seems to actually give us life and that we feel your Spirit among it. God, help us to be like you, to become givers, to become increasingly each day not withholding to keep things for ourselves, but whatever you've blessed us with, whatever good and perfect gift you've given us, may we then turn our arms around to use those things to bless others, that all the world, all things, all people might be saved. Help our story to very correctly tell the story about what kind of God you are. Amen.